On the 30th of May, 1431, inside of a French town, there was a huge crowd gathered to witness one of the most shocking executions in history. A girl of around 19 years old was led out to a stake where the executioners were ready to light the fire underneath her. But this was not just any normal girl. This was a girl who became a patron saint of France and who turned the tide of the 100 Years' War for the French. Joan of Arc claimed that she had been sent by angels to help the fate of the French against the British, and she's remembered as the peasant girl who lost her life at the hands of the English, who wanted to put her to death as she was considered so dangerous. But some people that day, who saw the flames rose high, claimed that they burnt a saint and that they thought horror would come to England for Joan's execution. But why specifically was she sentenced to death? In 1337, the 100 Years' War began, and this was due to a number of disputes between the French and the English about who was the rightful claimant to the French throne. Since the Norman conquest of England in 1066, there had been a number of links between the two nations' royal families, and the English launched their offensive against the French. To begin with, they had significantly the better of it, defeating the French in many different battles, and the result of this was the negotiations took place to install a dual monarchy between England and France. Henry V, who is best remembered as the English king who won a spectacular victory at Agincourt, was instated as the heir to the French throne, and he then married a French princess, Catherine of Valois. The Queen of France stated that she would leave the crown to the English and would not name her own son the king. And following the death of Henry V in 1422, the young son of Henry, Henry VI, was then named the King of England and France. However, he at the time was a very young child, and a regency council was established to help him rule, led by John of Lancaster, Henry's uncle, who was named the regent. But the life of Joan of Arc was very humble to begin with. She was the daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabella Rome, and she grew up in a small village known as Dumery. Her father worked as a farmer, and they did have a small amount of land where they could grow food. But Joan witnessed an attack on her village, which was burnt to the ground by rebels, and she was not someone who was educated. She could not read or write, and she did have a rather religious childhood. When she was just 13, Joan had visions for the first time, and these were religious visions. She claimed that they had struck her whilst she slept in her father's garden, and specifically St. Catherine, St. Michael and St. Margaret had visited her. They had instructed her to visit the Dauphin of France and to protect him after the English had been defeated. They said it was Joan who would drive the English out once and for all, and she stated that the saints were beautiful, but she had to do something about this. Now, most people did not believe the young teenage girl. They thought she was either telling lies or that she had gone mad. She visited a local French garrison commander when she was 16 and asked him to be escorted to the French royal court to meet with the Dauphin of France. But the commander would not do this. Joan continued to ask. But the forces of the commander were convinced that she was gifted and was holy. But at the time the French began to win some skirmishes. Joan had predicted that they would win near to Orleans, and this is what occurred. She was allowed to go to the French royal court, and she passed under the noses of the English to do this, and in 1429 she met with the Dauphin, Charles. He could not believe what she was saying to begin with, and he thought that Joan was saint-like, and he then placed his full faith in her. He wanted new ways of fighting the English, and to try and get them out once and for all, and he thought that Joan may hold the key to this. At the time, some treated Joan with suspicion, as they believed she could have been a witch or a religious criminal. But the Dauphin trusted the word of these saints, and with this she was interrogated by monks to see if she could be trusted, and they said that she was of sound moral standing. But Charles then deployed Joan amongst the army to see if she could help lift the lengthy siege of Orleans. This had begun in the October of 1428, and the English held the area around the city. And it was a very important place. Joan, on horseback and in armour, helped a convoy to take supplies into the town, and she then planned to attack the English in the north. The commander fighting the English would not listen to her, and he ignored her. But Joan then ordered an attack on a close-by English prison. But at the time, Joan was also said to have carried out a miracle. The wind at the time changed direction, and the French ships and convoys could sail to Orleans. She entered the town with huge celebration, and the French saw her as a hero, and she distributed food and money to the soldiers. By messenger, she ordered the English to leave the area, and this was the beginning of her successes. She was hit by an arrow in the neck close to the shoulder, but did recover. Some claimed that she had been looked after by angels again, and this wound could have easily killed her. The siege of Orleans had been lifted, and Joan was said to have been the important turning point in this. She became known to her enemies, and the English wanted her tried for witchcraft. They did not want to believe that a young girl could be the reason why they lost, and they thought that God was on the side of the French. Further victories then came for the French, and the Dauphin Charles later became the king, and he shrouded Joan in gifts. He asked her to be with him holding her banner when he was made king, and further attacks against the English continued. Their assault on Paris had failed to begin with, but Joan then began to be more outspoken about problems with the church and those who were being persecuted. She criticised heretics and said the army would execute anyone who did not believe her faith. However, she was then betrayed. She was involved in a raiding party that attacked the Burgundians, but she was captured after being ambushed by them. Joan struck with her forces, but was grabbed from her horse, and she gave herself up. She was then locked inside of a prison, and she tried to escape, but was then moved to other more secure sites, and she was then passed over to the English. They paid a significant fee for Joan, and she was their star prisoner, and they wanted her to pay for her crimes against the English army. For this, she was brought to trial and accused of heresy, and it was meant to embarrass her. The English did not let Joan go. She was too dangerous in their eyes, and she was accused of a huge number of crimes. Nuns were brought in to see if she was pure, and she tried to defend herself. But then, on the 29th of May, 1431, she was sentenced to death for heresy. The following day she was executed, and Joan was to be burned alive at the stake for being a witch. She screamed when she heard that this would be her fate, and she stated she would rather have been beheaded, as it was more straightforward. Some of her guards laughed at her, but others were more sympathetic, and in front of a crowd of 10,000 people, the 19-year-old Joan was taken to the stake, where she was tied to it, and a guard held out a wooden cross in front of her. Joan kissed the cross, and the fire underneath her was then lit. One man who witnessed her execution claimed, "I was present at the last sermon on the day she was burnt." There were 3 galleries of scaffolds, one where the judge sat, one where the many bishops sat, and one where wood was prepared for the burning of Joan. At the end of the sermon, the sentence was pronounced which delivered Joan to secular justice. After this sentence was pronounced, Joan began to make many pious exclamations, and among other things she said that nothing she had done, either good or ill, had been suggested by the king. Thereupon I left, not wishing to see the burning of Joan, is all many of the bystanders weeping. The flames continued to rise, and Joan was secured to the pillar, and there was no way out, and a priest held up the crucifix for her to focus on as she died. But a number in the crowd screamed. Some witnesses even threw extra wood on the fire, and they wanted her to suffer no more and succumb to her death ordeal. But the English, after her death, then burned Joan's body twice more, to make sure nothing was left of her. This was to prevent relic hunters taking parts of Joan for veneration for the French cause. Thank you for watching, and to support, please remember to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.